Thank you all for coming at our last event of the year. We had 6 events so far this year, all of them very successful. For those who are attending for the first time, let me tell you a bit about the Council. We've been in business for 3 years now. We had around 16 different events. We publish lots of blogs, articles, research. We are a financial think tank, focusing exclusively on fiscal policy, monetary policy issues. Nothing else. That's what matters, your pocket and mine. We have actually a board of 16 members. We have invited over the last 3 years around 1,200 people. I'm talking about unique invitees. We're expanding, we're growing by leaps and bounds. I hope all of you who are coming for the first time are going to be regulars to our event. We'd like you to get involved. What's happening out there is an absolute disaster on all levels. But let's talk about the fiscal policy issues. The government has become extremely intrusive in our affairs. By the way, this is behind closed doors, so you can say whatever you want. There's no media, nobody's going to harass you, nobody's going to follow you. And that's how we like to do it for every one of our events. So anyway, we're not a political organization. We're not Republicans. We're not Democrats. We're a think tank. We're here to find solutions. Solutions to our economic problems and woes. Very few people today think about solutions. Everybody's bitching. They're not happy with this, they're not happy with that. Whether in Congress, whether in the administration, whether on Wall Street, everywhere. We want everybody here to start thinking, providing solutions, alternatives, no matter how controversial. I'd like to thank first all of the board members, all 16 of them. Would you please stand up? They've been at the forefront of change. They've been supporting our organization. We're reaching out for corporate sponsors also. We want to become a factor 3 years down the road at the next presidential elections. The topic today is going to be about private regulation as an alternative to government regulation. Wow, I like this subject. When Ed approached me with that, I told him this is really interesting because it pushes the envelope even beyond the Ayn Rand objectivism. That's what I like in it. We're talking about going beyond that. Look, these are ideas. We have to push those ideas. We have to think about them. Edward Stringham has been a professor of economics and entrepreneurship for a couple of decades. He earned a doctorate in economics from George Mason University. He appeared on 100 broadcast stations, CBS, CNBC, CNN, everywhere. He's an authority on the subject matter. So I don't want to steal the thunder here. Ladies and gentlemen, Edward Stringham.
All right, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Ziad made sure that I had as radical of a talk as possible. So I'm going to try and be controversial as possible, and maybe even jump over this camera at the end of the talk. This talk is loosely based on a book that I'm writing called Private Governance. It's under contract with Oxford University Press. I'll be finishing it over the next couple months, and so any feedback that I get on any of the ideas, I have plenty of time to incorporate it, but I do have a complete draft, and I'll hope to be submitting it to them at the end of this year. And that will be this. The issue I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, for my intro, and then the next part of my talk will be 2 hours. And after 30 minutes, I'll open it up for questions and answers. So the question that economists and basically everybody in the world needs to talk about is, what's the best way to encourage commerce, markets, and specifically financial markets? I'm going to summarize the issues at hand, then I'm going to give some historical case studies to talk about how financial markets worked throughout history, and then I'm going to talk about the implications. So the majority of Americans agree Wall Street is a good thing. Wall Street is required for the process of financial intermediation. You need people to help channel money from savers, from investors, to companies. Without the process of financial intermediation, we'd have all of our money under our beds, not doing anything. So the Americans agree that Wall Street, the majority of Americans agree, Wall Street is absolutely essential because it provides money businesses must have for investment. However, Okay, there's always a but. Sometimes it's a big but. The majority of Americans also believe recent events have shown that Wall Street should be subject to tougher regulations. Okay? So most people assume that government must create the rules and regulations necessary to protect parties in exchange. And the economic theory behind it is people can engage in what are called prisoner's dilemma situations where cheating is optimal. I'm just curious, out of people here, how many people have heard the term prisoner's dilemma situations? Okay, good. So most of you. All right, so most prisoner's dilemmas are written in a box, but this is just a tree. But basically the idea is people would be better off choosing to go right and cooperating. That would be the ideal. But the incentive is to always cheat. Okay, imagine we engage in a trade. You give me your end, and then I say, oh, sorry, did I say I was going to give you my end? Right? And then both of us go through that mindset, and then we end up cheating. That's the theory behind the prisoner's dilemma. The main solution, according to most people, is government needs to create the rules and regulations to make trade work. So to alter the payoffs, to force people to cooperate through law. So I'll just give a couple quotes just to show this is very widespread, even among very free market economists. So Israel Kirzner says, without enforceability of contract, market cannot operate. Follows institutions of market cannot be created by the market itself. You need extra market enforcement. Richard Epstein, another free market guy, he runs a classical liberal institute at NYU. He says, sorry, Svetlana, I'm criticizing 2 NYU people in a row, so I hope that's okay. All of you NYU people out here. Epstein says law is critical to offer a framework for voluntary transactions to take place. He says without law, one would be a naive visionary to believe markets could operate without any support for the state. Douglas North, Nobel laureate, says you can have some trade without government, but in a complex world, you need the state to make sure people cooperate. He says that a coercive third party is essential. And then last quote I'll give is from Manker Olson. I'm an equal opportunity offender, Aisha, University of Maryland graduate. These people are terrible. Most of the gains from transactions like those in the capital market require impartial third-party enforcement. Okay, so the idea is you need an external body enforcing the rules of the game. So that's the standard view. Markets cannot solve the problem of things like fraud. Governments are able to solve the problem of fraud. Therefore, government is necessary. So we have people like Dodd-Frank and Elizabeth Warren and all these people adding more and more rules and regulations every single day. This is just a graph of the Dodd-Frank Act. It already has 12,000 pages, and it's not even a third written, or it's just over a third written. Okay, so each day they're adding more and more and more regulations, and in many cases, and I was chatting with a couple of people earlier, we don't even know what those are going to be. We have no idea what those are going to be. So that's why we need government rules and regulations. Thank you. Okay, I'll take my check, please. Any more? Anything? Okay, should I do the second part of my presentation? No. Actually, no, I'm just kidding.
I have a question.
I do have the second part of the presentation. You have 30 seconds.
30 seconds. What happens when the government people are private sector people and you have the revolving door between government and the private sector and the conflict of interest and everything? Just if you could address this before you continue on.
Okay, great. This is my next slide, actually.
Oh,
Thank you.
I can read you mine.
All right. Okay, so the question that I want to ask as an economist, this is what economists are always talking about, is just because we want something to be good doesn't mean it's actually going to be good. There's very few perfect things in life. Maybe a few exceptions. There's some perfect things in life. But when you want government to do something, it's not enough to just wish that they're going to be able to do it, because you have all of these personal interests, personal imperfections of the people you're taking from the street and putting into these offices. Just because people are put into this office, it doesn't mean they're going to be perfect. So these are the views I'm going to be contrasting. And the idea that government passes a law and then it works perfectly, versus the idea that it might not work at all, might work terribly. So the question that I would always want economists and everyone to ask is, can the government solve the problem in a low-cost way? Does the government have the knowledge to solve the problem? Does the government have the incentive to solve the problem? They might know how to solve it, but not care. And lastly, are there private solutions? So if the answer of some of these is government doesn't have the incentive or the knowledge, maybe we want to look at alternative. So I'll just highlight these problems quickly, and then I'm going to go through and give some historical examples. When it talks about government passing rules and regulations, almost always they ignore the cost to the private sector. Almost always it's like, okay, yeah, we're going to pass a law, and that would be good. Without thinking, what is the time involved for the businesses that have to comply with the regulations? What is the time involved with even the consumers? I was fortunate enough to buy a condo a few years ago, and my mortgage broker, she said, Dodd-Frank, if I had one wish in life, it would be to repeal Dodd-Frank. And I'm thinking, like, if I had one wish in life, I could come up with a lot of great wishes, but it's like the top of her list is get rid of Dodd-Frank regulations. Okay, so that's how bad it is that after 2 months, I was like pulling my hair out, like providing paperwork after paperwork. And she's doing this every single day for the rest of her life. So there's a cost of writing the regulations, complying with the regulations. In some basic sense, Wall Street's already spending billions of dollars per year just on compliance. And if you look at larger estimates of regulation, some people estimate that we have to look at the compound cost of regulation, and that decreases economic growth. And according to one economist named Dawson, we're 75% poorer than we would be without all these regulations. Because year after year after year, people are spending time doing unproductive things. Just a couple things. Since we've had an increase in regulations the past 2 years, you've seen huge decreases in the amount of credit available to people. Is it because of the regulations? Maybe, maybe not, but it's definitely correlated. We have the same thing with Sarbanes-Oxley a few years ago. Huge increase in regulations for companies going public, and lo and behold, record decrease in companies going public. So lots of things that people say are going to help investors actually end up harming people. It prevents people from getting loans. It prevents companies from going public. The next point is, does government have the knowledge? How knowledgeable are these people? Well, in some abstract sense, they're geniuses. They're all geniuses. But in reality, in many cases, they're just following the beat of the drummer from Occupy Wall Street. So Occupy Wall Street used to be a couple blocks from where I lived, and I would see these people every day of my life, which is terrible. But there was a survey of them, and they would say things like, I'll just give you a couple quotes. This is OccupyWallStreet.org. One is, we want to outlaw credit agencies, immediate across-the-board debt forgiveness for all, debt forgiveness of sovereign debt, commercial loans, home mortgages, home equity loans, credit card debt, student loans, personal loans now. It's like, okay, great. We're just going to wipe out all debt, and who's going to lose money? What about us, everybody who actually put money in the bank? The same people that they're talking about, they're concerned about, are the people who are going to be wiped out in this situation. They did a survey of Occupy Wall Street protesters, and they said, who's the chairman of the Federal Reserve? 42% said don't know. What is the SEC? 68% don't know. What is the Dodd-Frank Act? 84% don't know. Now, Elizabeth Warren, the senator who is devising all of these regulations, she says, I created the intellectual foundation for Occupy Wall Street. I support what they do. Okay, so if that's the intellectual foundation of people are advocating regulations, they don't even know what the SEC is. Of course they're going to ask for a lot of regulations that they haven't necessarily thought through. Okay, and then finally, I'll mention government might not have the interest in solving a problem. And basically the idea is it's sometimes in their center just to create more and more regulations, regardless whether it's a good idea. Or go after certain people. Here's Mark Cuban. They went after him for insider trading, and the evidence they had against him was there were pictures of him with lots of money in the picture, like this is somehow evidence that he engaged in insider trading. Okay, so that's the first part I want to ask is are there costs of regulation? I think the answer is yes. And the next part of my talk I want to mention about are there alternatives? Because rather than assuming government is the right answer, we want to look at what the alternatives are. Is it possible that private parties can create rules and regulations that we can rely on without relying on government? And I want to start with a personal story. This is actually a true story. I was trying to buy this tie on eBay from Brooks Brothers. This is new. It's a real nice tie, striped tie. And so I was very excited. And this is actually true. In the mail, rather than getting a striped Brooks Brothers tie, they sent me this paisley tie. This paisley tie is the worst tie ever. I hate paisley. I got one complimented on it earlier, so thank you. But when I got it, I was devastated. I was like, okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to call the cops. I'm going to call the cops. I'm going to call the FBI. I'm going to call the SEC. I'm going to go get them. Go get my money back. I did it. This part of the story is not true. Nobody called me back. Cops don't really care about things like that, do they? Think about lots of things that could happen wrong in your life, and how often would the cops or the FBI or the SEC really care to spend time helping you with your problem? So in the case of eBay, there's really nothing you can do through government. But what did I actually do? Who ventures to guess what I did? Yeah. So eBay has its own private dispute resolution system. eBay is basically a club where everybody who agrees to join it agrees to follow a certain set of rules, and if they don't, there's a private trial. And in this case, eBay evaluated the system, and they said to me, okay, yeah, you're right. They're not responding to your emails, so they gave me my money back. And they let me keep the tie. All right, so this is just one example I want to highlight. This is actually very common in history. I'm going to give you 3 quick examples throughout history to point out examples of privately regulated markets. The first one I'm going to talk about is in 17th century Amsterdam. They created the first stock market, basically right around 1600. And you can see some of the headquarters, some of these buildings today. The East India Company financed Henry Hudson to discover the North River, the Hudson River. And also the West India Company founded a place called, yes, New Amsterdam. So these are privately financed voyages, and people didn't really plan for it to be a long-term venture. People started trading in the back of a commodities market. Eventually, the trade started becoming more and more sophisticated. It became a permanent market. Government wasn't designing this market. Government didn't expect things to happen as they did. They didn't know what the market was. And once prices started fluctuating, this is kind of a theme throughout history. If prices go down, always happens, government says, oh, fraud, it must be fraud. Because prices went down, it must be fraud. So in early 1600s, government outlawed a bunch of contracts. They said you cannot engage in any of these contracts. But nevertheless, the government started, outlawing a bunch of contracts, but nevertheless, the market started having very sophisticated contracts. So short sales were against the law. People did them anyway. Forward contracts, they were against the law. People did them anyway. Options. Did anybody know options were invented in 1600s? Not enforceable in courts of law. Hypothecation, which is a type of loan using securities as collateral. Securitization, creating new securities based on existing securities. All these things happened completely outside of the law. And why is that? Well, this book you can find, there's some copies online, it's a great book. But there's a stockbroker who describes what happens. And he says, you know what? If you want to default on your contract, you can. It's illegal to engage in any of these contracts, so you can default. He says you can just turn to the ordinance of Frederick Henry and say, I don't have to pay. But if you go through it, this book, he says that's not common. He says when a loss occurs, losers are expected to pay what they have at the moment. When the wound is fresh, there would be no new injury. Other people gradually fulfill their obligations after having sold their last valuables and thus meet with punctuality, the reverses of misfortune. So why would anybody follow through with a contract when it's not enforceable? Yeah, okay. So if you're dealing with somebody once and you cheat them once, are you going to have much future dealing with that person? So in this book, there's lots and lots of discussion of the importance of things like goodwill, reputation, people spreading the ideas throughout. He says there's widespread honesty and expedition on the exchange. Nobody changes decisions which he makes in his momentary passion. His words are held sacred, even in the case of price differences of 50%. Such honesty, cooperation, accuracy are admirable and surprising. So I'm not going to be able to go through this book in depth, but there's just page after page of here's how this contract's illegal, and here's how it worked. So reputation, discipline of continuous dealings, repeat dealing serves as an alternative to actually having government rules and regulations. So that prisoner's dilemma I showed you earlier is a one-shot prisoner's dilemma. You might have an incentive to cheat if it's a one-shot game. But if you're interacting with people every day for the rest of your life, that changes incentives. You cheat once, you're not going to have that person as a potential trading partner. You cheat once and he can tell other people, then you're not going to have a lot of other potential trading partners. All right, next example I'll talk about quickly. 18th century London, the next major stock exchange. Here too, government didn't understand financial markets. They outlawed lots of contracts in it. Adam Smith says buying stocks by time is prohibited. Law gives no redress. But he says all laws against gaming never hinder it, yet all great sums are punctually paid. Why? Same type of thing. He says persons who game must keep their credit, else nobody will deal with them. Quite the same for stock jobbing. They who do not keep their credit will be turned out in the language of Change Alley, be called a lame duck. So that's the origin of that word, lame duck. People who defaulted would get kicked out of the coffee house. They would all go and start trading in a few places in Exchange Alley, and it was totally informal. Eventually, people took a private coffee house called Jonathan's Coffee House, and they said, let's start creating and enforcing rules. So on the board, they would say, if this person defaulted, we're going to write that person's name on the board. Eventually, they started having entrance requirements. If you want to be a member of this stock exchange, you have to get recommendation letters. You have to pay a deposit to become a member. And by doing this, they created what was then called New Jonathans, which eventually became called the Stock Subscription Room, which then was called London Stock Exchange. And their motto was, my word is my bond. Okay? So transforming something from a marketplace without any rules on the curb into a private club that created and enforced rules. These are just a couple pictures of these coffee houses. Let me mention briefly, insurance markets evolved the same way. Lloyd's of London was called Lloyd's Coffee House. They also created a system of private arbitration to settle insurance disputes. Moving forward in New York, I'm sure everybody knows a bit about this history, but we had the Buttonwood Tree Agreement. Eventually, the New York Stock Exchange started creating more and more rules, including having disclosure requirements, listing requirements, basically providing a lot of the assurances that people believe must come from government. Futures exchanges, the cocoa exchange had rules. Futures exchange is a really interesting phenomenon because one of the main things they deal with is counterparty default risk. When you go into a futures exchange and you meet someone, you say, I want to buy a bunch of that type of cocoa from you, and I'll pay you money 3 months from now. There's a potential that I could default. But what a futures exchange will do is actually manage the counterparty default risk. So even though you and I think we're making a contract together, we're actually separately both making a contract with the futures exchange. So if any one of us defaults, we're having a default against the futures exchange. That means us, as individuals, we don't have to worry about counterparty default risk. So the better futures exchanges can manage counterparty default risk, the less you need to rely on government rules. Let's just move forward a little bit. These are the types of people, I'm sure some of you have met some of these people, but these are the types of people you see at the futures exchange. They're crazy, right? They're crazy people. But as long as you've hired a private club to manage their behavior, you don't have to worry about them defaulting. Other examples I'll give very quickly. In your personal life, there's lots and lots of transactions you make. It would be too difficult to go to government courts to have them enforced. It would be too difficult to go to government courts to have lots of little things enforced. PayPal was one example. 12 years ago when they were founded, or actually a little bit, 13 years ago at this point, when they were founded, they are having lots of fraudsters stealing money from them, and they would call up the cops and say, can you help us? And the cops were like, I have no idea what you're talking about. You're talking about fraudsters stealing money from this electronic account, which we don't understand. And moreover, the fraudster's based in Uzbekistan, and we don't know what that is. Okay? So you can't get money back from an honest fraudster. So what PayPal did was they created a system of financial intermediation where they managed the risk on behalf of all of their customers. When you make a transaction on PayPal, PayPal has a system where they're monitoring it in real time. Is this a legitimate transaction? Did somebody hack into your account? They assign a score to it. If it's more likely to be fraudulent, it's flagged for individual review, or they might ask you to do certain things. The more accurately they can predict fraud, the less you need to rely on government rules and regulations. So that's just one great example of private solutions rather than government rules and regulations. Since then, credit card companies have adopted many of these things. The fraud prevention technology is quite amazing. All right, so they view this rather than a legal question, is they view it as an economic question. And they liken it to being like a pipeline where you want to get the water through the pipeline, but if you have water being stolen from fraudsters, that's bad. If you turn too much water away because your rules and regulations are bad, that's also bad. So rather than thinking about these things legalistically, when you pay somebody, a private party, to manage and assume risk, it changes it from a legal question into an economic question. So that would be one area where I happen to disagree with some of my objectivist friends, is you can actually think about these things economically. Banks do the same thing. They've got this whole process change where they approve things. And as you can see here, they've cut the fraud rate online down to close to zero. So 1%. There's certain things that you just don't want to do, okay? Google Nigeria. Please enter your bank account here. Okay, so let me just wrap up. There's lots of private things that people already do right now and historically that they have done to make markets work. So rather than assuming government is the only solution to things, we can have different things. Dealing with friends. If you deal with people you know, you're going to trust them. Dealing with honest people. If you deal with people who have a great reputation, you can trust them. Repeat dealings. If you're dealing with someone every day, it's going to make that contract self-enforcing. Reputation mechanisms. If you want to sully your reputation, it's the equivalent of losing money. In addition, you can hire third parties, assume and manage risk. You can hire third parties to create and enforce rules. You can create all types of bonding mechanisms. So where most people assume government is the solution, I'd like to ask, if there's a need, why won't private parties try and search for that need? And the main thing I'd like to focus is the difference between government and private is private searches for profits. And if there's a problem, it's a high chance you're going to see people saying, can I profit from solving that problem? Right? Imagine making money off of solving problems. Well, that's in many ways what financial intermediation is. Getting money all over the world to people who don't know each other to help finance projects among complete strangers. I think it's fantastic when I think about Wall Street. When I go to bed, I'm like, oh, Wall Street. So great. Advantages of private rules and regulations. They're flexible. They're not too costly. They're not going to be too costly because if they are, people are going to say, this is bringing us down. They have to think about the bottom line where government regulators don't. So to sum up, I'd like people to be thinking about even the most basic things that government does. Can we have these things being done by the private sector? Government can't even create a website. They can't create a website. How do we expect them to understand what credit default swaps are, what mortgage-backed securities are, what collateralized debt obligations are? I always meet these people and derivatives ought to be outlawed. Can you tell me what a derivative is? It's like no. Those are the people who don't understand economics, don't understand finance, should not be creating the rules of the game. So I'll just end on this great quote from Voltaire. And this is about the London Stock Exchange, one of the best quotes about a private rule-enforcing club. And he says, go into the exchange, that place more venerable than many a court. There will you see all of the representatives, all the nations assembled for the profit of mankind. There the Jew, the Mohammedan, and the Christian deal with one another as if they were the same religion and reserve for the name of infidel those who go bankrupt. Thank you very much.